Hi, thank you for joining me for today's tutorial on how to knit magic loop. I personally use magic loop a lot and I definitely use it for knitting all my socks. There's several reasons why I find the magic loop method easier than DPNs. The first reason is that you haven't got several needles that you're trying to juggle at once. And the second reason is traveling is so much easier when knitting in magic loop, and your stitches are less likely to fall off the needles whilst in a travel case. So let me show you in today's tutorial how to knit magic loop. Okay, so to knit the magic loop method, you will need a cable needle. So to practice, you can use any size cable. Today I'm going to be using the Knit Pro Symphonies 2.25 just because they're to hand and it's my go-to needles for knitting socks. But just to practice, you can use any size cable that you have to hand. So to begin with, we're going to do our cast on in the normal way that you would if you were using straight needles. For this demonstration, I'm going to cast on 40 stitches using the long tail cast on method. But as I say, you can use any cast on method that you personally prefer. And at this point, just treat it as a normal straight needle that you would normally be using, and then just cast on in your normal way. So go ahead now and let's just cast on for this demonstration 40 stitches. Okay, so I've now cast on my 40 stitches, and just for the purposes of this demonstration, I've placed a marker at the halfway point. And whilst you're trying to learn the magic loop, you may find it helpful to do the same. So I now have 20 stitches this side of my marker and 20 stitches this side of my marker. And what I'm going to do now is just lay my needles down just so you can see what's happening with the needles as well. So we have the first needle that we cast our stitches onto, and now we have our cable that's running round to the other needle. I'm just going to lay these out flat so there's no twist in the cable, there's nothing going on like this. It's just a nice loop from needle to needle. And what we're going to be doing next is transferring the 20 stitches that are at the back of our needle towards the cable here onto our second needle here. So this is why this marker comes in quite handy in the beginning, because you don't have to fiddle around trying to count stitches whilst transferring your stitches onto your second needle. So if you find it easier just to pop a marker in for the first few times of doing magic loop, then do so. So what we're going to do to transfer these 20 stitches across to our second needle is to slide the stitches towards the end of the needle. So you can now see that they're going onto the cable here. And we're just going to keep sliding those up until the point we reach our marker here. Then you'll notice that you can flex this wire. So we're just going to give it like a bend here. So that means that the 20 stitches, the other side of my marker, stay on the first needle. And then we are just going to put that bend in that wire, grab hold of that wire, and just very carefully and slowly pull those stitches down the cable. So you can see there's no twist in the cable. And we're going to keep doing that until those stitches reach our second needle. Okay, like so. So if I lay them down flat now, you can see that we've got 20 stitches on the first needle and 20 stitches on our second needle. So now we're ready to begin to knit magic loop. Okay, so I've just removed the marker because we no longer need that there now. So now we're ready to begin to learn the knitting method of magic loop. So we need to ensure that there's still no twist in our stitches or the needles or the wire. So again, at this point, I would just lie your work down flat and just check that the stitches are all laying nice and flat. Okay, so you can see in this one there's a slight twist, so I'm just going to lay it all nice and flat. So the stitches are all the same way, and there's no loop in my cable here. So I'm going to call this one the top needle and the bottom needle. So the top needle was the one that we had our original cast on stitches onto, and the second needle is our transfer needle where we move the stitches round. So what we're going to do now is pick them up. So we have the top needle, the first needle that we cast on at the back, and the transfer second needle is facing us. Okay, so the one closest to me is the transfer needle, the second needle, and our original cast on needle is at the back. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to, I'm just going to move my tail out of the way because it's quite a long tail. In fact, just for this purpose, I'm actually just going to trim that tail off. Okay, as I don't want it to get confusing for you. Okay, so once you're happy that everything's laying as it should do, what we're going to be doing is taking the top needle and bringing it around to the bottom transfer needle. So before we do that, I'm just going to make sure that my working yarn is at the back of my work. And then I'm going to pull this top needle out. Just slide down onto the cable, which you bring the needle completely out, and then you bring it around to the bottom needle. And then we're just going to knit these stitches as we normally would. So I'm just going to go ahead and knit across these 20 stitches. So these setup rows, the first couple of rows are the hardest, and then you'll find that you just get into a flow. And sometimes these stitches can be a little bit awkward and stiff from the cast on. Okay, so that's the end of that needle now. So we've now transferred our stitches from our transfer needle, our bottom needle, to our top needle. So what we need to do now is to turn. So we just hold the work like this. You can see that's the top needle now with the stitches on instead of the transfer needle. And now we're just going to turn the work over. Okay, so the top needle is at the back, and then the cable with the stitches on are now facing us. So what we need to do now is to pull this cable so that these stitches from the first needle slide up onto our transfer needle. Okay, and then you just carefully slide them on, and again taking the working yarn and making sure it's away from you, otherwise it will just cause a loop. Okay, so you just make sure that's out the way at the back. We're going to take the top needle, the one furthest away from us, I'm going to pull it out, and then we're going to bring it round to the needle closest to us. And again, we're just going to simply knit these stitches. So go ahead and knit across this needle. Like so. So you can now see the pattern of perhaps what we're going to do. So we now need to turn this over and pull the wire through so that our stitches slide up onto the bottom needle. And don't worry about this here, that closes up the more rounds that you do. So working across those two needles is classed as one row because you obviously have to knit the 40 stitches to complete the row, as you would knit 40 stitches if they were on your straight needle. So we mustn't get confused that working one needle is one row. We have to work both sides to complete one row. So we've done one row of knitting at the moment. So again, we make sure the yarn is out of the way at the back, and we're going to pull the back needle around to the front needle, and we are going to knit again. So this is the start of our second row. So just go ahead and just knit across. So that's the end of that needle, and then again we just need to turn and we need to pull the cable so that the stitches on the wire just feed onto the needle. And then we need to repeat the process again on this needle to complete the row. So remembering that the working yarn is away from you, pull the needle around to the needle facing you and knit across the 20 stitches on this needle, and this will complete the second row. Okay, so that's the end of our second row. So again, we turn it over and we pull the cable so the stitches slide up onto our needle, and the working yarn is at the back, and we make sure the yarn is away from us, and we again repeat the process of pulling that needle out and around to the front needle, and again we knit across. Okay, so just finished that needle there. And I'm just going to share with you just a couple of ways in which you can keep track of whether you're halfway through your row or whether you're at the end of your row, especially if you get distracted in the beginning with the phone ringing or somebody at the door. So one way that I can tell that this is the first half of my row is that my tail end is on this side of my work. The other way you could keep track of that if you didn't want to use the tail as your guide is to simply pop the marker back into the work. So if we just hook that through the bottom there, we know that that is the first half of the row. So we haven't completed the row yet. So we need to turn it over. And then once we've completed these stitches, we know that that's a complete row. So we just glide those stitches onto that needle, making sure the working yarn is at the back. And that's another way you can always tell if you're doing the magic loop right, is that the working yarn should always start on the needle furthest away from you. Okay, so that's always at the back, and you always want to make sure that this working yarn isn't falling between the needles. Always make sure that it's away from those needles, otherwise it would just cause a loop across. Okay, so you just pull that needle round to the needle facing you, and again we're going to knit across the second half of our row, and you'll begin to notice that it gets easier from this point onwards. The first couple of rows are always the trickiest getting it started. Okay, so that completes row 3, because we can know that because we've knitted the front half of the stitches, and then this is the remaining 20 stitches of our 40 stitch count. So again, we just turn it over, we pull that wire through so the stitches glide onto the needle. Okay, we take that yarn and we place it away from us. Okay, and we can tell we're at the beginning of our row again because we've got our little marker here, and we've also got our little tail on this side of our work. So making sure the working yarn is away and not in between those two needles. We are going to go again, pull that back needle out and bring it round and knit the first 20 stitches. Okay, so just coming up to the end of these 20 stitches. That's the first half of the row done, because we've got our little marker. We know that's the first half, so we've not completed a row yet, so we need to turn it over. Just glide those stitches onto the needle nearest us. Again, ensuring the working yarn isn't hanging between the two needles, and we're ready to go. Pull that back needle out and bring it round to the front, and we're going to knit across the remaining 20 stitches of that row. So just coming up to the last couple of stitches now, and that completes row 4. So you can see now how this is beginning to form our knitting. So I'm just going to do a couple more rows, because I want you to see how now that gap of that yarn is closing up, and how it will transform into a complete round and you won't have any gaps. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and do a few more rows with you just to show you that. So let's just adjust the knitting. So we're going to slide the stitches onto the bottom needle, and we know we're at the beginning of our row because we've got our little marker that tells us we're at the beginning, and we're going to move that working yarn out from between the two needles, and we're going to pull the back needle out and bring it round to the front, and we're just going to continue knitting. So the other thing to remember when knitting in magic loop compared to knitting on straight needles is that we're knitting every stitch, but we're actually creating stocking stitch instead of garter stitch as you normally would if you were knitting on straights. So when you're knitting socks, for example, you're knitting every stitch for a simple knit sock, like something like this. Okay, so stockinette is knitting every stitch instead of knitting one row, purling one row. So that's the difference as well with magic loop. Okay, so that's the first half of our 40 stitches. Turn, pull the cable so the needles slide onto the needle. Working yarn is at the back and the yarn is not falling between the two needles. Pull that back needle out and bring it round to the front and knit across the remaining 20 stitches. And that completes another row. So you can really see this coming along now. You can see the stockinette, and you can see that you haven't got any of the joins across the side. So in the beginning you might panic with that yarn stretched across, but as you knit it just all closes up, and that is how you knit in magic loop. So you can now hopefully see how that would work when knitting socks or cowls, and it's just a lovely way of knitting. And as I say, it's so much easier to carry your work around with you. You can pull this one back onto the wire if you want to where you're traveling, and the stitches aren't going to fall off. And when you pick it up, you'll know exactly where you are, either by your marker or your tail end, to know that you're at the beginning of a round. So I really hope this has helped you learn to knit magic loop. Do like and subscribe to the channel, because I will be bringing out how to knit a basic sock using magic loop in both men's and ladies and children's. So if that's something that is of interest to you, then do hit the subscribe button, do like the video so other people get to see it, and I shall see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you soon.